Our gospel reading is from the book of Luke. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that, when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Preachers and scholars don't always agree. Sort of like pastors and parishioners, don't you know? Maybe this weekend especially, you know that. But we have all long agreed that this little story Jesus tells of the dishonest manager is the hardest parable. Now, it may be hard to apply to our lives, but then again, many things Jesus says are hard to apply to our lives, right? I mean, Mark Twain once said, "It ain't those parts of the Bible I don't understand that bother me, it's the parts I do understand." And I think we can all agree with that. We're really good at modifying Jesus, taking the edge off of what he says in order to make it a little easier for us to live it out, right? I mean, you know, like that whole part about selling all you have and giving it to the poor. Or that part about loving your enemies and doing good to those who hate you. Or that part about forgiving 70 times 7. How many is that? You know. We understand what he's saying there. We just rather not follow him all the way there. Right? Tolly Campolo spoke at the New Baptist Covenant Summit in Atlanta this week. He teaches sociology at Eastern University in Philadelphia. Tony's kind of a powerful radical Christian, and he teaches this to his students as well at this Baptist college. So one day he said one of his graduates came into his office, his father pulling him in there, and his father started yelling at Tony for what he did to his son. Because his son graduated and started working in the inner city with the poor instead of fulfilling his good middle-class college degree and American ambition and getting himself a proper job. You know. Well, the father just kept getting more agitated, and finally he said, "Look, I'm okay with Christianity up to a point, we all have our point, don't we? The point beyond which we really don't want to go with Jesus. Well, that might also be true with this parable we'll see in a little while, but before we get there, just understanding the point is hard with this one. For instance, if you treat it as an allegory and not a parable, you might tend to think of the rich man as God, who is so upset with the bad stewardship and management of his surrogate that he sends him straight off to hell, and that's what God will do to us if we fail to be good stewards of our lives. And to me, it seems even odder that once the judgment is made, then when the dishonest manager doubles down on dishonesty, suddenly he's exonerated. The rich man changes his mind. How are we going to teach our children that? I mean, is that good moral education for our kids in church? That if you follow Jesus' wisdom about selfish and conniving behavior, you'll get rewarded in the end? That doesn't seem right. So here's the first principle of interpretation of parables. Look for the forest, not the trees. Parables have one big point to make, okay? And this parable, the big point that it makes, we still can't agree on. Commentators and preachers alike seem to fall into two categories of interpretation on this. It's either all about forgiveness or money. So, forgiveness first. If it's about forgiveness, it makes some sense that it immediately follows the parable of the prodigal son. Both of the central characters are guilty of squandering their lives, and in each case, there comes a moment when the jig is up and they realize that their profligate living has come to an end, and they are desperate to figure out a way to be welcomed into a home, right? And so, in the case of the prodigal son story, the forgiveness seems to flow sort of downward from the father to the son. All that is required of the son is just to come empty-handed back to the father, to drop every excuse and come just as I am without one plea, right? In the case of the dishonest steward, it seems to flow upward instead. That is to say that his debts are forgiven only after he is found forgiving the debts of his debtors, which sounds like the Lord's Prayer, doesn't it? Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So the point must be that if we want to be welcomed by God into an eternal home in heaven someday, we better get started down here on earth, forgiving everybody as much as we can, or we may not be forgiven one day. So maybe there's some truth to that, but there's something troubling about that too, isn't there? Hold that thought while we go on to the second interpretation, which is a view that, what shall we say, it's all about the Benjamins. That is to say, it's all about money, how we misuse it for evil and may reuse it for good. On this side, Jesus does say something peculiar in this passage about using dishonest wealth to make friends for yourself that will get you into an eternal home. What an odd thing to say, huh? And he does say something at the end of the passage that we cannot serve both God and mammon. And in the verse that we didn't read that immediately follows, we are told that the Pharisees were quite upset about Jesus' teaching about all of this because it says they were lovers of money. And even more, a few verses later, Jesus tells the parable of the rich fool, in which, remember, the rich man won't even give the poor, hungry man Lazarus the crumbs from his table, and he's judged after he dies, and you know that story. If you don't, come next week, you'll hear more about that parable next week. But if this makes sense in that context, if it's about money, then probably this parable should be better understood in light of what follows it in a parable instead of what comes before it. And in that case, we should read it as a warning against greed and about not caring for the poor and the hungry. So it's about what we do with our money. I remember one of my preacher heroes, Cecil Sherman, who used a passage like this to justify his talking straight to church people about tithing, whatever it takes. He said that how we handle our money does have some impact on our eternal destiny. Here's his line: "I consider it my spiritual duty," that's the way he talked, "to deliver people from that which, if held too tightly, will send them straight to hell." God rest his soul. So maybe we should pass the plates again after the sermon. What do you think? We could take care of that budget deficit all at once. And all God's people said. But here's the problem with that interpretation. It's really the problem with the first interpretation on forgiveness, too. It seems to turn salvation into something we do to merit God's acceptance. We may be scoundrels, but before it's too late, if we just get busy making amends somehow, then maybe whether we go about forgiving each other and showing mercies to each other or just start throwing money at it, giving it to charity and good causes and all that sort of thing, maybe God will be impressed enough with our sincerity that we'll get let into heaven when we die. This isn't far off from the way the church has functioned for centuries. You know that for ages, the mafia, for instance, has abused and terrified ordinary citizens, has extorted small businesses and trafficked in criminal behavior of all kinds, and then given generous, dishonest wealth contributions to the church. Right? What, to buy forgiveness? One writer on this phenomenon says, "For many years, priests have been happy to allow the mafia to dress themselves up as upstanding members of their communities. And even we have learned the Vatican Bank has been found to have been laundering money for the mob for years in order to enrich itself." Well, no more. The unflappable Pope Francis, on pain and threat of being killed himself by those who didn't want to be so called out, went to Sicily, the home of mafia influence in Italy, and he made it clear that if you cheat the poor or you mistreat the vulnerable in any of these ways, that you'll do so on threat of excommunication from the church. There will be no buying salvation through donation for those who practice extortion. And we can say the same thing for payday lenders. I like to get that part in there. Those who abuse the poor and entrap them in debt intentionally, and the same for politicians who take their money in exchange for influence over legislation. Same for payday lenders, also who, like the mob, give their ill-gotten gains to charity. Don't use Jesus to justify injustice. One payday lender, Phil Locke, had started a small business called Cash Now. He got out of the business a few years ago and became an informant on the industry and said he was trying to bring reform to it. He called some of his former partners some of the greediest people he had ever known, and he seemed to have gotten religion because he sold many of his possessions and tried to live a more simple life. Oddly enough, nobody really took him seriously. That his conversion was real, that he saw the light, And indeed, eventually, he went back into the business. Turns out he had really hedged his bets. didn't actually sell his stake in the company. He gave it to his mother. So it was there for him when he got back into the business. He said his wife missed the trappings of the life they'd gotten accustomed to, and so had he. I gave it a shot just to see what I could do, he said. It didn't work out. I had to return home. Home? Home? Not an eternal home. By returning to a lifestyle built on mammon that always abuses others to enrich yourself, you will never enter into an eternal home. Judgment is coming, thus says the parable. So if it's not really, though, about forgiveness or money per se, even if there are implications for both of those things, what is this parable about? Enlightened self-interest. I think that's it. Now, I know when I use the word enlightened today, my goodness, I can almost hear myself getting yelled at by cable news programs. Enlightened seems to be a loaded word, right? It raises the cackles of some people because it seems to be tied to the arrogance of those who think they are more knowledgeable about things than those who cling to tradition. It's usually thought of as so-called progressive educated elites who look down their noses on conservatives that they think are unthinking, prejudiced, and backward. You can just about summarize our current presidential campaign that way. It isn't hard for that sort of thinking to invade the church. I've been so accused lately. And if I harbor it, I should be judged for it. Because here's the truth, the moral philosopher Immanuel Kant was right when he said, excess of light blinds too. That is to say, you can be blind because you won't come out of the darkness into the light, and you can be blind because you're looking straight into the sun. Neither group has an exclusive purchase on arrogance, and neither has a copyright on humility. We all have to watch ourselves, don't we? Progressives, even in the church, should embrace enduring things. And conservatives should remember that God is not finished shaping the world or the church into more equitable, just, and merciful ways of living. Still, let's blame Jesus for this. He talked about children of the light, right? And he said that we should be as shrewd in dealing with our own eternal interests as those of the world are in dealing with their temporal interests. Self-interest, in other words, does not have to be selfish. This is the key to the parable. The phrase enlightened self-interest means that individuals and groups that act in the interest of others will end up benefiting themselves by their generosity. So doing well should always and only be judged on the basis of doing good. See? Which means doing good toward your neighbor. The problem with so much of our society these days is that we think we are in a zero-sum game on everything. We think there's only so much freedom to go around, so much prosperity to go around. We have to get ours regardless of what happens to someone else. Jesus' parable teaches us to have a more enlightened, spiritual, community-oriented, neighbor-focused view of things. It's about living in such a way that all of us have a chance together. Not some of us get the privilege and others don't. It's not about charity that you give to others, whether forgiveness or money, in order to impress God and secure your place. It's about living according to the rule of grace, which is the way God has made the world from the very beginning and always operates according to it. And it's about the way the world to come is going to be operating too, so let's get ready for it. The reason the rich man in the parable, is pleased with the shrewd manager in the end is the same reason he is so upset with him in the beginning. Think of it. It's because the rich man doesn't value things the same way everyone else in the story does. The rich man wasn't concerned with what was his. He was concerned with the injustice being done in his name. Do you see that? He was angry that the manager didn't trust him to take good care of him, which led the man to cheat him and his customers by overcharging them. The customers only paid what they thought they owed. They didn't know they were getting cheated. And when the manager finally cuts their debts, you see what's really happening here? For the first time, the manager realizes he's a debtor too. Dear people, the church is only secure when it remembers that the church belongs to God and not to us. We are only stewards of it for a time. We all belong to God, and God wants us to count ourselves among all the debtors who are saved by grace and grace alone. Caleb McClurg puts it this way: instead of trying to prove how wronged we have been or how righteous we are, we can be like the manager and get busy using our talents in a new way. Jesus calls those who have benefited from the influence of the powerful to turn now to making friends among the least. Whatever we have, whether honorably or illicitly gained, we can use it to build a new kind of community, not achievers, but debtors all. Among the dismissed and dispossessed, we will find our true home. Only there, friends. Only there. Amen.